America's secret mind control experiments. They tried to erase. They called it MK Ultra. Two simple syllables that sound almost harmless clinical, even. But behind those coded letters was a program so dark, so grotesque, that it continues to haunt the collective memory of America. This was not a science fiction plot. It was not a movie script. It was real. And it was orchestrated not by rogue criminals or hidden cults, but by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, the very institution sworn to protect the nation. The story of MK Ultra begins in the shadows of the Cold War. The late 1940s and early 1950s were defined by paranoia. The Soviet Union had just tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, breaking America's nuclear monopoly. The Korean War had erupted, and whispers filled Washington that communist powers were not only winning wars on the battlefield, but also waging psychological battles, wars of the mind. American soldiers captured in Korea sometimes returned home strangely altered, reciting communist propaganda or making confessions that seemed impossible to believe. The word brainwashing entered Western vocabulary. And for the CIA, this idea became an obsession. If enemies could manipulate the human mind, America needed to master it first, or risk being left defenseless. It was within this atmosphere of fear and competition that the CIA authorized one of its most notorious undertakings. In 1953, under the leadership of Director Allen Dulles and the control of chemist Sidney Gottlieb, the agency launched Project MK Ultra, a sprawling, secretive attempt to unlock the mysteries of human consciousness. On paper, the goals seemed straightforward, even patriotic, to develop techniques that could resist enemy brainwashing, extract secrets from captured spies, or potentially control foreign leaders. But in practice, MK Ultra spiraled into a nightmarish labyrinth of chemical, psychological, and physical experimentation, often performed without the knowledge or consent of those subjected to it. The scope of MK Ultra was staggering. Dozens of subprojects operated under its umbrella, each with its own bizarre focus. The effects of psychedelic drugs like LSD, the power of hypnosis, the use of electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, isolation chambers, and even more sinister techniques. Funding was laundered through front organizations, universities, and research hospitals, so that even scientists who thought they were doing legitimate work often had no idea they were fueling a CIA black project. Sidney Gottlieb, often called the poisoner-in-chief, became the architect of this hidden empire. A soft-spoken chemist with a deep interest in mysticism, Gottlieb believed the mind could be broken down, erased, and rebuilt like a machine. His vision was simple but chilling. If one could destroy a person's existing identity and consciousness, perhaps a new one could be implanted, an obedient personality, loyal to the operator. It was the ultimate weapon of control, and America was willing to pay any price to find it. But that price would be measured not in dollars or resources, but in human suffering. Ordinary citizens, prisoners, hospital patients, and even unwitting CIA employees would all become subjects in this dangerous quest. To understand MK Ultra is to confront a paradox at the heart of American power. In its desperate attempt to defend freedom, the United States government sanctioned one of the most grotesque violations of freedom imaginable: the secret experimentation on its own people. For decades, MK Ultra remained buried under layers of classification and denial. Only in the 1970s, when congressional hearings and investigative journalists unearthed fragments of truth, did the program come into the light. By then, most of the records had been deliberately destroyed. What survived were shadows, fragments of documents, testimonies from victims, and whispers of horrors that could never be fully proven. And yet, even those fragments paint a chilling picture. They tell of lives destroyed, minds shattered, and ethical boundaries shattered beyond repair. They suggest that beneath the polished image of American democracy lurked a machinery willing to treat its citizens as expendable subjects in a dangerous game of psychological warfare. MK Ultra is not just history, it is a reminder that secrecy can breed monsters, and that even the most powerful nation on earth can descend into darkness when fear drives policy more than morality. This is the story of how America's brightest minds, armed with near limitless resources, sought to conquer the human mind, and in doing so, left behind a legacy of broken lives and unanswered questions. And the story is only beginning. If the introduction to MK Ultra sounds disturbing, the actual experiments were nothing short of terrifying. What unfolded under the CIA's watch blurred the line between science and sadism, between research and outright abuse. One of the central obsessions of Sidney Gottlieb and his team was the psychedelic compound LSD. When Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann first synthesized it in 1938, few could have predicted that this substance, capable of inducing vivid hallucinations, altered consciousness, and extreme psychological states, would become the CIA's favorite weapon. To Gottlieb, LSD was a potential truth serum, a drug that could shatter resistance, strip away secrets, and leave individuals utterly vulnerable. So the CIA began testing it. At first, the trials involved willing participants, college students, soldiers, and academics who were paid small sums to ingest the strange chemical, but soon, the boundaries dissolved. LSD was administered to unsuspecting people in public places, slipped into drinks at bars, sprayed into food, or given to CIA employees who had no idea what they were consuming. The logic was chilling in a real-world scenario. The enemy would not consent to being drugged. So why should test subjects? One infamous project was known as Operation Midnight Climax. In this bizarre subproject, the CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, disguised as brothels. Sex workers on the CIA payroll lured men to these locations, where their drinks were secretly laced with LSD. Hidden cameras recorded everything, as agents watched behind one-way mirrors. The goal was to observe how the drug affected behavior, especially in situations of intimacy, vulnerability, and shame. The victims, of course, never knew they were part of an experiment. But MK Ultra was not limited to LSD. Hypnosis was another frontier. Could a person be placed under deep hypnosis, given secret orders, and then carry them out later without memory of the suggestion? This was the seed of the so-called Manchurian Candidate scenario, the dream of creating a programmable assassin. While evidence suggests the CIA never fully succeeded, countless individuals endured invasive trials, hypnosis sessions, and psychological conditioning that left them traumatized. Then came sensory deprivation. Scientists discovered that isolating a human being, placing them in a dark, soundproof room or a water-filled isolation tank could quickly break down their sense of identity. Within hours, subjects reported hallucinations, paranoia, and panic. To the CIA, this was useful data. Perhaps isolation could erase existing beliefs and make the mind more pliable. But for the test subjects, many of them students or hospital patients, it was a living nightmare. And perhaps most disturbing of all were the experiments performed on vulnerable populations. Prisoners in American jails, patients in psychiatric institutions, and even people in foreign countries under CIA control were targeted. In one case, LSD was administered to a patient for over 70 consecutive days. In another, prisoners were promised shorter sentences if they volunteered only to be given doses so extreme that some never recovered. The casualties of MK Ultra are difficult to measure, partly because so many records were destroyed. But a few cases stand out. One of the most infamous is Dr. Frank Olson, a U.S. Army scientist who attended a CIA retreat in 1953. Without his knowledge, Olson's drink was spiked with LSD. Days later, he suffered a mental breakdown, spoke of leaving his work, and expressed doubts about CIA activities. Soon afterward, he fell from the 10th floor of a New York hotel in what was officially labeled a suicide. His family, however, believed he was murdered to keep him silent. Decades later, President Gerald Ford issued an apology, but the full truth remains shrouded in mystery. Beyond individuals, entire institutions were compromised. Universities across America, Harvard, Stanford, McGill, and others became unwitting hosts to CIA-funded experiments. Professors accepted grants through front organizations, often without realizing the darker purpose. Some students who signed up for psychology studies walked away with lifelong trauma, never knowing they had been part of MK Ultra. The destruction of documents in 1973 ensured that much of MK Ultra will never be fully understood. But the surviving fragments reveal a systematic, calculated attempt to weaponize the human mind without care for morality or human dignity. At its heart, MK Ultra was not just about science. It was about control. Control of enemies, of spies, of populations, and perhaps most chillingly, control of America's own citizens. The program raises haunting questions. How many lives were destroyed in the name of national security? How many unwitting people spent their last years in psychiatric wards, never knowing they were victims of their own government? And how much of what we don't know remains buried in classified archives, erased from history? MK Ultra reminds us that sometimes the greatest threats to freedom come not from foreign adversaries, but from the shadows within. For 2 decades, MK Ultra operated in shadows. Thousands of subject students, soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients were drawn into its web, many without knowledge or consent, but secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, rarely stay buried forever. By the 1970s, the CIA's darkest project was unraveling. The beginning of the end came not from a heroic whistleblower, but from chaos inside the CIA itself. In 1973, amid the Watergate scandal, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MK Ultra documents. His motivation was clear: to prevent exposure. If the truth ever came out, it would devastate the agency's reputation. And so, countless boxes of files detailing experiments, test subjects, and methods were shredded. What survived did so by accident. Some 20,000 pages misfiled in the wrong department, discovered years later through a Freedom of Information Act request. Meanwhile, cracks in the facade were forming. Journalists in the early 1970s began to piece together stories of strange experiments conducted under government contracts. But the real turning point came in 1975 with the Church Committee hearings, a series of investigations led by the U.S. Senate into intelligence abuses. What they uncovered shocked the nation: illegal surveillance of American citizens, covert operations against domestic political groups, and, among them, the specter of mind control experiments. The public reaction was one of disbelief. America, a nation that prided itself on freedom and democracy, was confronted with the reality that its own intelligence agency had conducted experiments on unwitting citizens, experiments more reminiscent of authoritarian regimes than of a free society. Perhaps the most explosive revelation was the case of Frank Olson, the Army scientist who had plunged to his death after being secretly dosed with LSD. His story, brought to light during the hearings, symbolized the human cost of MK Ultra. Olson's family demanded answers, and in 1975, President Gerald Ford personally apologized to them in a rare White House meeting. Yet even this apology was partial. Key details about Olson's possible murder were concealed for decades. The hearings also revealed the scale of the program. Over 80 institutions were linked to MK Ultra through front organizations, universities, hospitals, and research centers. Professors and doctors took funding without always knowing its source, conducting experiments that ranged from unusual to inhumane. At McGill University in Canada, psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron conducted experiments with CIA funding that included heavy doses of LSD, electroconvulsive therapy at dangerous levels, and psychic driving, a process of playing recorded messages for patients in endless loops to reshape their personalities. Many of his patients were left with permanent psychological damage. These revelations forced the American public to confront an uncomfortable truth: the government had betrayed its own people. And the victims of MK Ultra, most of whom never consented, never knew, and never received compensation, were left to cope with shattered lives. Some tried to fight back. Lawsuits were filed against the CIA, though many were dismissed on grounds of national security. Others were quietly settled out of court, with victims receiving small payments in exchange for silence. But money could not repair broken minds, ruined families, or lost decades. The exposure of MK Ultra also fueled a broader cultural paranoia. Suddenly, the idea of mind control was no longer science fiction. It was a historical fact. The revelations fed conspiracy theories, sparked distrust in government, and bled into popular culture. Movies like The Manchurian Candidate 1962 seemed eerily prophetic. Later, television shows, novels, and films drew inspiration from MK Ultra, cementing it as a symbol of state-sponsored horror. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of MK Ultra lies in what we don't know. The destruction of documents in 1973 ensured that the full scope of the project will never be revealed. How many people were experimented on? How many lives were lost to drug overdoses, mental breakdowns, or suicides? How much of the research continues in classified programs under different names? These questions remain unanswered. Even the survivors were often left in the dark. Some only discovered decades later that their strange hospital treatments or university experiments had been part of MK Ultra. Others never made the connection, living and dying without realizing they had been test subjects in one of history's most unethical programs. In the end, MK Ultra was officially disbanded, buried under layers of government apologies and bureaucratic distancing. The CIA promised reforms, and intelligence oversight was strengthened. Yet the stain remained. The program had shown that in the pursuit of power, morality could be discarded, and citizens could become expendable. Looking back, MK Ultra stands as a grim reminder. It tells us that the greatest dangers to liberty may come not from external enemies, but from those entrusted to protect us. The CIA's dream of mastering the human mind ultimately failed. LSD did not produce truth serums. Hypnosis did not yield perfect assassins, and sensory deprivation did not create programmable spies. But the attempt itself revealed something darker: a willingness to sacrifice human dignity in the name of control. As one senator famously remarked during the hearings, we must never again allow our government to treat its people as laboratory animals. And yet, the shadows of MK Ultra still linger. For if a government could erase its own records, silence its victims, and bury its secrets once, what prevents it from doing so again? Conclusion: the haunting legacy of MK Ultra. MK Ultra was more than a Cold War project. It was a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human ambition. Behind closed doors, in university labs and hidden government facilities, men in white coats pursued the fantasy of absolute control, believing that the human mind could be broken, rewritten, and owned. They failed, but their failure left a trail of broken lives, scarred families, and unanswered questions. The irony is stark: the free world, in its struggle against communism, mirrored the very authoritarian abuses it claimed to oppose. While the CIA searched for ways to create Manchurian candidates abroad, it turned its own citizens into unwilling test subjects at home. Freedom. it turned out, could be suspended in secret. Democracy could be quietly bypassed, and ordinary people could become expendable tools in experiments they never agreed to. Even today, the shadows of MK Ultra stretch far. Conspiracy theorists argue that fragments of the project survived under new names, buried inside classified research programs. Neuroscience, pharmacology, and psychological warfare continue to advance, often hand in hand with military and intelligence funding. How much of what we know about brainwashing, interrogation, and psychological influence traces its roots back to those LSD-soaked chambers of the 1950s and 60s? We may never know. What is certain is this MK Ultra forced the world to confront a chilling truth. The danger is not only in what governments reveal, but in what they are capable of hiding. For 2 decades, MK Ultra thrived in secrecy, shielded by bureaucracy, protected by lies, and erased by shredded documents. If not for accidents of history, the misplaced files, the courage of a few investigators, we might still be in the dark. And so, the legacy of MK Ultra is not just about the past. It is a warning about the future. When the pursuit of security and control overrides morality, when secrecy becomes a shield for power, and when citizens are treated as test subjects rather than as human beings, the cost is always greater than we can imagine. The truth is that MK Ultra was never about protecting freedom, it was about controlling it. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is this: the moment we forget that, the experiment begins again,